Welcome back once again, guys, to the Proudly Made in Africa, where we explore the essential conversations around trade justice, sustainable businesses, and human rights essentially. I'm your host, Raj Maverick, and today I'm very thrilled to have Sabita Banerji join us. Sabita is the CEO of TURST, the International Roundtable for Sustainable Tea, and she brings a profound commitment to uncovering and addressing the systemic injustice within the global tea industry. Yeah, here she is, guys. So I was just having a quick intro back on the background there.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining
fine.
us.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for joining us today, Sabita. Oh, wow.
Thank you. Thank you
Okay,
very much for having me on the podcast.
welcome. So I was gonna jump right in and say, is it okay if we start from a chronological manner where I just, get some insight about your story and then we can address some of the questions? Awesome. Thank you. So
Sure.
I've seen that you've spoken passionately about the shocking, poverty faced by the tea producers. And for those who are not aware, can you shed some light on how you came about uncovering, the living conditions and seeing more personal touch within the industry of these people?
Sure. Yeah, I was actually born on a tea plantation in South India, and was brought up there and in Assam. And so saw at first hand, how people lived around me. And then we moved to the UK when I was a child, and after I graduated, got into development, international development, and I worked for Oxfam for many years. So got to understand a lot more about poverty and the drivers of poverty, which is often more about injustice than anything else. And then later, I worked for an organisation called the Ethical Trading Initiative, which is a tripartite organisation involving companies, trade unions, and NGOs. And while I was working there, I happened to have visited my birthplace in South India. The day that I arrived there was a huge uprising of women workers just by complete coincidence. And so that got me thinking, what I talked to them, I asked them, why they were doing this strike, and the issues that they told me about were really shocking. They had their pay wasn't enough, they felt, to cover their basic needs. They had very poor housing that was often built in the era of the British Raj, where these tea plantations first started. And this was despite the fact that this was on a plantation which is considered, one of the better ones, who looks after their workers better.
Wow.
And the issue is more about the system that the tea industry operates on, which is a very colonial system. Eventually, I decided to set up THIRST to try to work with not just the tea workers, but also with their employers, with the people who buy the tea, with the companies who sell it. So along the whole value chain, because everybody within that value chain, that supply chain and value chain, has a responsibility, including those of us who buy the tea. So I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of their responsibility in tackling these injustices.
Wow. And would you say that so far, just an overview right now, there has been progress in terms of raising that awareness and that has somehow affected the livelihood of these people?
Well, I think so. I mean, I wouldn't, be so unhumble as to claim it's all because of THIRST. But I think THIRST has come along at a time when there is increased awareness about human rights and about the responsibility of businesses to ensure that workers throughout their supply chain, that their human rights are realized. And, there's increasing laws now coming through, making it legally responsible, making companies legally responsible for the human rights of their workers in their supply chain. And I think what THIRST has been able to do is to join other voices within the tea industry to help them to understand how they can ensure that human rights are being realised in the industry. So we've done research on the human rights impact of the tea industry on the tea workers and farmers globally. And we hope that those resources are helping tea companies and everybody involved in the tea trade to analyse the situation and to adjust their practices accordingly. Whether it's had any impact yet, I would say there's a long way to go. The tea industry is 200 years old, and it's one of the industries that's most resistant to change, I would say. So I think there has been an impact in terms of people are more aware, people realize that they've got to do something about this, but I think there's a long way to go before the industry will really substantially change.
Wow. Okay, so I understand that tea is, if not the second most consumed commodity in the world after water, but yet it does have a very vast and complex supply value chain. And somehow the producers are on the least beneficial rank, right? But my question is, the employers of these producers in their communities,
Yes.
who are they? Are they locals? Are they, people within that society? Or are they, and not just that, secondly, but because I understand they handle the exportation of these products and all, but who really has, or what's the structure of the leverage within the supply chain? Can you break that down a bit for us?
Sure. I mean, the first thing to say is when you talk about producers, there are two kinds of producers in the tea sector. One is plantations, which, as I said, that system was set up by the British and has been maintained pretty much in exactly the same structure and system ever since then. And those are often owned, either they've been taken over from British companies by local companies in those countries, be it India or Sri Lanka or Kenya, Malawi, and sometimes they're still owned by British or foreign companies at least. But they're usually managed by local people. But you were very right in your question. You phrased it: are they people from the local community? So even if they are Indians or Sri Lankans or Kenyans, often they're not from the local community. They're not, and so in those plantations, the workers are the ones who are really suffering. The owners of the plantations and the managers have a better standard of living. But there are also an increasing number of smallholder farmers in the tea sector globally. And that's a very different kind of setup, because they grow the tea and then they sell it to factories. So they have all the challenges that any smallholder farmers in the agricultural sector have. So they don't have employers, but they have the struggle of trying to get a decent price for their tea and trying to earn enough to ensure that their families are looked after.
Wow. Okay, so I understand that it seems like the managers definitely are getting the larger, chunk of this whole value. But the question is, over time, I'm pretty sure there should have been some unions that would fight for the rights of the workers. Now, are these supply chain challenges so complex for the managers that they are not able to gain value in terms of maybe the exploitation logistics is challenging for them, and that is why the workers are quote unquote getting the blowback from this? Or is it just a case where the system is playing the whole part where, okay, the managers are getting all the money and there is no benefit, no security for the workers at all?
Well, it's not the managers who are getting all the money. They have a slightly better, well, a very much better lifestyle. But if you look at a report that was done by Oxfam, I think it was in 2017, the distribution of the value, like when you buy a box of tea bags, the biggest chunk of the money that you pay goes to the supermarket. And then there's the packers, the buyers, the traders, the brokers, the auction house, and only then is it the managers and the owners and the managers, and then after them it's the clerks and the the those sort of stuff, and then the very last in line are the women who pluck the tea, and it is mostly women who do the tea plucking, and they are the ones in the lowest paid jobs. And you asked about trade unions. Yes, actually, the tea industry in many countries is unionized. But workers, the women that I mentioned in South India, who I talked about it as an uprising rather than a strike,
Yeah.
because they were protesting against the trade unions as well as the company. And they were
Wow.
saying that the trade unions don't represent them properly. The trade unions are very male dominated, while pluckers are mostly women. They don't come from the local community. They tend to be more representatives of political parties. But having said that, it is a positive that they do have trade unions, and trade unions have done some good work in negotiating better wages. And also ensuring that there's equal pay between men and women, for example. So the trade unions are there and they're doing some good work. But again, it is, that there is a lot of room for improvement.
There's also, there seems to be a lot of players, middlemen between the supply chain. So it makes me ask the question. This is mostly during the distribution, like you mentioned, not the processing.
Yeah.
So is it like the processing of this tea is fully managed on the plantations or like in the factories? That means
Yeah.
most of the value should be captured on that side of things as well. But for some reason, the system places the weight on the distribution. And we
Yeah.
understand that if the production is halted, then there is no distribution. So I'm trying to
Exactly.
understand how these colonial roots that has created this system still justify themselves still today. What do you see is really happening behind the scene that is making sure they maintain these systems, even though they might be working in their benefits, but they seem to
Mm.
still be accepted globally for some reason.
Mm. That's a really good question. And I mean, particularly about the issue of, that the value should be produced at the production level. So the actual process of making made tea, the black tea or green tea that you can buy, is not a very complex process. The green leaf is plucked. It goes to the factory. It has to go quite quickly to the factory, and there it's kind of withered and rolled and roasted, and this produces the black tea.
Yeah.
What happens after that is that where the value comes in is when it's blended with other teas. So in the UK, for example, about 40% of the tea that we drink in the UK is from Kenya, but it's blended with tea from other countries to get a particular balance of flavors, because Kenyan teas are quite strong and they've got this nice orange color to it, whereas a tea from another country might, change the flavor slightly. So there are all these blends, and the packaging as well, that adds a huge chunk of the price that's paid for it. I mean, you were asking, how is it still that the at the factory level they're getting less money? And I think that is because of these systems that were set up. So the auction system in particular. So tea is the only commodity of that kind that's sold by auction. I mean, coffee is not. Cocoa, those kind of products that don't go to an auction house, but tea traditionally, the system that was originally set up is still maintained. And the people who went into the tea industry and took over from the British just maintained the same system, which is very, very much dominated by a small number of big, powerful companies. And it's in their interest to maintain this system, because from their perspective, it works very well. But what is happening, and I hope that those companies realize this, is that it doesn't work well for the workers. And as a result, they are leaving the industry. And so now they're bringing in more and more mechanical harvesting. and that is then putting more people out of work. It's actually reducing the quality of the tea. Yeah, it's the system that was put in originally and has been maintained. Why it doesn't change is a really good question. And I said earlier that, you know, it's an industry that is very resistant to change. And that's one of the things that we found in our research that we did about why are there these human rights breaches in the industry? What's the root causes? And this resistance to change was identified as one of them. There's a phenomenon called organizational imprinting, where, you know, when an organization emerges and there are very strong influences on it at the time, it can be very difficult for that organization to shake those systems and attitudes and practices off, unless there's a crisis, which there is now. So that is what TURST is hoping, that because the tea industry is in crisis now, this was a good opportunity to say, okay, let's ditch this 200-year-old system, or let's keep what's good in this system and ditch what's bad in it, and explore some new alternative approaches.
Interesting. Because I understand also that it's natural to see how when something is already established, and so I'm talking about the large corporations that are already winning, they don't see the incentive to change what's happening, because it's now like you're asking them to reduce how much they are gaining and providing it. So they ask themselves, why should they choose to accept those conditions? So I'm trying to understand what recent achievement has happened besides the crisis. That's because I'm pretty sure technology has also helped that awareness level to rise up and increase the volume or the impact of the crisis. But besides that side, because everything comes down to legalities and agreements, what agreements or milestones have been achieved in gaining, leverage over these large corporations, in allowing them understand they need to share some of those value as well? Has there been any milestones so far?
You know, these corporations are, I think the biggest leverage over them are these incoming laws. So the European Union laws, soon there's going to be mandatory human rights due diligence for companies over a certain size, due diligence of human rights in their supply chains. And so a lot of companies are now thinking, wow, you know, we have to do something about that. Whether that will be done in a meaningful way, or the NGOs and civil society and trade unions, everyone needs to, you know, monitor that to make sure it's being done meaningfully. One example of a company, it's not a huge company, but Thai Fu, which is a very well-known brand in the UK, as you know, they have recently launched a campaign called Fear-Free Tea. And this was in response to a documentary on BBC Panorama last year, exposing some really terrible cases of sexual abuse of workers, women being forced to exchange sex for the opportunity to get a job, or to have a less onerous tasks, etc. And what Thai Fu have done, which is really unusual for a brand, is that they have branded their boxes of tea and on their website, and they've said that, you know, women in the tea industry are at risk of sexual abuse, and they've said that their mission is to make tea fear-free, and they have got this Fear-Free Council, which THIRST is a member of that council, as well as other advisors. And we are there to try and make sure that they're not just greenwashing, that they're, you know, genuinely holding themselves to this. So they're not saying that if you buy their tea, they guarantee that that is fear-free. I mean, that would be just oversimplistic. What they're saying is that's their mission. And so for a company to so publicly talk about such, you know, distressing human rights issues on their packs, that is quite different. And, you know, we're hoping that that will actually influence other companies to take the same approach. And we're hoping that it will also influence consumers to really understand that this drink which is associated with friendship and comfort and society and community. You know, you feel sad, you have a cup of tea, you want to wake up in the
Yeah.
morning, you have a cup of tea. For them to know that actually, you know, the women who are producing it are really suffering, and that they need to use, as you say, use the social media, etc., to improve
The
these
awareness.
workers' lots. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, interesting. And that's true because I've read a couple of times where, the gender-based violence and harassment, it's evasive. It finds a way to go sort of under the radar, but it's
Mm,
a very rampant issue in the
mm,
industry.
mm,
Now I understand a little bit of how the strategy TURST is using to, work on those issues, which is working with the brands to make sure other brands can see the success of those brands. So that's an interesting route. I'm just curious, uh, because it seems to come down to the nature of family structure as well, where women seem to have the lower hand in the family structure because we do understand that there are other industries to work in, right? So what's making sure these women stay in the industry and like, put themselves in those situations or find themselves in those situations where, someone is actually putting them to say you have to do this to get this job and stuff. And is it the basic jobs of thirst of tea production, or maybe higher leverage job like a managerial job? Because it seems to be a bit confusing there.
mm. So, I mean, let's face it, Raj, sexual abuse and gender-based violence and harassment is evasive in every industry, in every walk of life. You know, you have to look at Harvey Weinstein,
Yeah,
all the sort of recent exposés.
yeah,
It's everywhere. In the tea industry, you know, there are particular aspects of the tea industry which put women at increased risk. So, and we're focusing mostly at the women at the plucking level, so to tea pluckers who
okay,
often have to keep reapplying for their job. So they don't, you know, even if they've worked for a tea plantation for many, many years, every season they have to apply for the job again. And
yeah,
and the people who are recruiting them, the managers, the supervisors, are almost always men. And so that puts the men in a very powerful position. And some of those men, not all of them by all means, but some of those men exploit that power that they have over the women. So what I mean, you rightly mentioned there are other industries, but actually in the places where tea is grown, there tends to be very few other industries, if any, because the tea plantations are huge. There are miles and miles and miles of nothing but tea. And often countries like Kenya, like Sri Lanka, tea is a huge foreign exchange earner for them. And so they've invested everything into the tea industry. And actually are very few, if any, alternative jobs for these women to go into. And in other countries, well, like India, where in some places there are alternative industries. So, like in South India, there's tourism.
yeah.
There's increasingly, you know, young people are going to the cities to work for, mobile phone companies and work in the mall and things. But there are other areas, like, you know, in the remote parts of Assam, where just the physical remoteness of where tea is grown, because it needs to grow on mountain slopes.
Wow.
Again, there's no other industry for them to go into. And the other thing that prevents women on plantations from going elsewhere is that usually the people working on tea estates have been brought there from another part of the country or from another country, and they are paid a small cash wage, but they're given free housing and food rations, which sounds very nice and generous, but it means that traps them there, because they haven't got enough money to be able to leave, and they can't sell their house because it doesn't belong to them. So in that structure as well, kind of keeps them in the plantation and keeps them at risk.
I've also noticed that there are some companies who, are trying to do it the right way, but of course, they are starting small. So it's not just in tea, of course. I've seen it happen in the coffee industry as well. But one of the major challenges that they face is with the logistics because they can't compete with the large corporations. So my question is there a need for responsibility on the government side to aid these, industries, these workers, substance or what they call it, subsidy or some form of finance, or is it solely a responsibility of the corporations?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It is absolutely a responsibility that should be shared by the government. And in fact, the well-being of their citizens, the government is the number one party that's responsible for that. They are responsible for the legislation and regulations that rule the companies. And so while there is a certain amount that companies can do and can try to do, they can't do it on their own. So
Yeah.
governments have to, they have to have good legislation in place. So, for example, they should have minimum wage in place that actually covers workers' basic needs and a bit extra. So the minimum wage should be a living wage, number one. Then they also should have legislation around working hours and, maternity leave and retirement and all of that. And many of the countries where tea is grown do have those laws, but then they also need to be good at implementing those laws and enforcing them, because that's the other problem that often happens. So, for example, in Kenya, there are very good laws which are supposed to protect women from gender-based violence and harassment, but these had not been implemented and had not been properly enforced. So, so governments have a huge role in terms of the tea industry itself. But I think also what governments need to do, two other things. One is to recognize that there is too much tea on the global market, and that is keeping prices down. So what tea producing countries need to do is to get together like OPEC and have an OTEC, a coalition,
Yeah.
to agree that we will keep the volume lower, and we will keep the price at a minimum price which actually covers the cost of production. And because currently what's happening is they're all competing with each other, they're all undermining each other, everybody's trying to produce more and more tea, and it's just making the situation worse and worse. And the other thing that governments in tea producing countries need to do is to invest in alternative sources of income for people. So like we were talking earlier about, there's no alternative for these women or the rest of their families. Because what are the men? The men are underemployed because the women are, mainly the
Majority.
yeah. So the government, should be investing and encouraging other businesses, other industries to establish themselves in places where tea is currently being grown, to reduce the number of people who are dependent on tea.
Yes.
And to reduce the volume of tea on the market, which would then make the price better.
That seems to be a very important aspect. Well,
Yeah.
OTEC sounds nice as well.
Yes, I think so.
I'm thinking, although you have touched on this earlier, but one thing I've noticed is, thank God we have the social platforms today. Even though there's a lot of division and noise on the platforms, we do see pockets of corners where there's interesting conversations happening and something really positive. So I know that many people will listen to these and find something sparking within them, like similar to the Pempila Omorai woman, right? But what do you see for our listeners who may be wondering, how can they make an impact, from starting today? So what advice will you offer to, I would say, consumers, even though we do more than consumption, but how can they support this ethical and sustainable tea, production?
There is a lot they can do, actually. I think often consumers feel a bit powerless, and they feel that they're just on the receiving end of whatever supermarkets offer them or whatever brands offer them. But believe me, the supermarkets and the brands are ruled by consumers. And if consumers speak up and say, what they want, then the companies will listen. So if consumers demand ethical tea, if they write to their supermarkets, if they write to their favorite tea brand and say, tell us, what are you doing to make sure that the workers are, safe from abuse, that they're being paid a living wage, that pressure from consumers will have some impact. They can also, try to buy fair trade tea. That doesn't mean that the problems are not there at all. Fair trade, does ensure that there's a bit more transparency around what happens on estates, and there's a floor price and there's a premium that's paid, but it doesn't. It's not always effective for workers in terms of their more fundamental needs, such as wages and housing, etc. But that's better than nothing to buy fair trade. But there's also THIRST has published a report on alternative approaches in the tea sector, where we have, as you said, there are these pockets of like people who are trying to do things a bit differently, who are not, working according to the colonial system, and who are exploring new ways of doing things. And many of those are around smallholder tea farmers and cooperatives of smallholder farms, who are joined together and are selling their tea either directly or through another company. So if you can find tea that's grown by a cooperative and sold directly, that's probably better than the sort of mass-produced tea from plantations. Although I have to say that I have to put the other argument, because THIRST is all about balance.
Yes.
But there are many people who say that it's all very well, but with the smallholder farms, you don't know what goes on behind closed doors. Maybe there's abuse there, maybe there's child labor. Whereas in the plantations, at least there's a structure, there's an HR department, there's people are paid wages. So it's a balance. On plantations, there is a structure and there's control and oversight, but there's a lot of control, if you know what I mean, and maybe a bit too much oversight. And there's less freedom for the workers there, and less empowerment, I would say. Whereas with small holders, there's more empowerment but less oversight. So it's a balance. But personally, I think that the future of the tea industry, if it is going to be resilient and fair for everybody, will be cooperatives or associations of smallholder farms, and the oversight coming from them working collectively rather than from them being employed by a company.
When we speak about the regulations, similar to maybe the IT industry where I used to work, I understand that we do have regulations, and for a long time, companies didn't adhere to them because there was nobody holding them accountable. It's similar to some governments within Africa as well. So I'm curious to hear about the audits that are done within those, regulatory bodies. Do they have sufficient, or are they lacking enough skilled resources to really go in and audit those companies that have those plantations or farms to really know what the people are going through? And then maybe there's a way to publicly share this information. So just a slight tangent, I've seen some products where there are people who have developed like softwares where we can scan a product, a face cream, for example, a multivitamin, and people can see, oh, this is what it really entails. Is it because people don't really know the meaning of all those chemical names, right? But now they can tell this is healthy, this is bio safe, things like that. But we don't have anything like that, obviously, for the tea industry. And an idea came to my head where after audits, people can see the tea companies that are good, are safe, or just depending on what metric we want to use to measure them. But I think a very good metric would be a company that is giving back to its workers. And if there's a way to be accountable and not just say, oh, the company said that they're doing this to their workers, that would be good. So do we have anything like that in the industry where there are regulations holding them accountable with audits?
Well, there are audits, and a lot of tea plantations are, certified by ISO standards, Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, and they do audits.
Mm,
But audits are not the best tools
mhm.
for monitoring human rights issues. It's too complex. You can't go in and spend 3 days on a tea plantation and understand the pressure that a woman tea plucker is under for the whole of her year, having to go to work 6 days a week, coming home, doing all the domestic work until late at night, and then the risks of gender-based violence, the pressure that the men in the family are under, the underemployment, drugs issues, alcohol issues. You can't just go in and audit something like that. You can look at the books and see this is what the wages that this woman has been paid,
Mhm.
and this is the working hours or whatever, but it will never give you the whole picture. I mean, I love your idea. It's a great idea,
Mhm.
being able to have something that you can scan and be able to tell more. In fact, I'm going to think about that idea and see if it could be applied in some way.
Yeah.
And actually, there are some people who are talking about maybe using blockchain in that way to try to be able to monitor one batch of tea right from
Okay.
where it's sourced to where it's consumed.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
yeah, but maybe not through audit, maybe more through community assessment, or civil society. I think is where the answer is, rather than
Okay.
audits, because
Okay.
audits are done by companies as well, by audit companies.
But what changes, in the next decade for the tea industry in a positive light? What vision do you have for the tea industry in the next decade?
My vision for the tea industry, and I think it's probably a realistic one, is that there will be no more plantations. The
Mm,
plantations are a colonial construct, and they are intrinsically unfair. Um, that they will be replaced by cooperatives or associations of smallholder farms, who have the benefit of working together. They can have the benefits of being able to negotiate prices and have economies of scale when it comes to buying fertilizer, or maybe even better still, that they don't use fertilizer and they're organic farms. I think this tea industry needs to shrink and get much smaller, um, because demand for tea is shrinking, even though it's still, the most popular drink in the world after water.
yeah.
Um, its popularity, there's in the Middle East and Russia is the huge market for tea,
Mm,
but those countries are not currently prioritizing human rights. The countries that are demanding human rights are not actually drinking as much tea as they were. So there needs to be a smaller group of producers, and they need to be producing really good quality tea, and consumers need to be valuing tea again, because when it originally started, when the tea industry began, it was a very, very precious drink. It was drunk by royalty and
yeah.
aristocracy, and then it became democratized. But then it's kind of gone so far down that road that it's become a commodity, and the system that was made to provide it for royalty is no longer fit for purpose. It's a 19th century system. So we've been talking to young people in Kenya, for example, asking them, what is your vision of the future of the tea industry? And they want to see a tea industry that harnesses new technology, that protects the environment, and that brings them into it, and embraces their ideas. I think that probably is the only future for the tea industry.
That's lovely. Okay, so let's expand that to what your vision would be for Africa as a whole. So it's a tradition we have here. We would ask you your vision of Africa. What do you imagine in the next decade or so?
I think Africa could be the most powerful continent, because Africa is the source of so much wealth in terms of resources, in terms of physical resources, but also human resources. You know, the creativity and the intellect and the enterprise of Africa. And I think, I mean, maybe a bit similar to the tea industry, that once, you know, people's minds and the systems have been fully liberated from the colonial era, I think Africa will really, really fly high.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Sabita. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Pleasure.
It's been an honor for just hearing your insights. I never really knew how much, deeply rooted these questions and these issues are, but today you've expanded my mind and hopefully our listeners' mind to go and do some more research. So where can we maybe find more information about TURST? I know the website, but if you just want to give us some more information on that as well.
Yeah, so the website is www.thirst.international, and
Yeah.
we have there's the news page where we have regular blogs and a monthly news update rounding up issues in the tea sector relating to human rights and the environment. But we also have a knowledge hub which contains over 130 resources, reports and studies and articles on these issues, and we're constantly adding to that. And so people are very welcome to have a look at that as well. We also have a donate button on the website. So if people
That
would
is
like to
amazing.
support our work, we'd be very much welcome that support.
Amazing. Thank you so much once again. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Raj. It's been a real honor and a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your great questions.
No problem. Thank you.